Dr. Kathryn Edin, thank you for joining me. Where does today's recording find you?
I am at home in Trenton, New Jersey, sitting at my living room table.
I appreciate you being here. Would you mind telling me a bit about yourself?
I'm a sociologist. I teach at a policy school at Princeton. I'm from rural America, a little town with one stoplight in central Minnesota. And I spent much of my career studying urban poverty, interestingly enough. So I think my sort of rural background was critical to sort of my trajectory. They call it Minnesota nice for a reason. If you learn Minnesota nice, you can get people to talk to you. And I found that just to be a skill, just being personable, being warm, being non-judgmental. That's really served me well in this business of collecting stories.
What drew you into this line of work?
So, as I said, I grew up in this small town, and then, but it was a very poor community in central Minnesota. My mom was sort of a social worker for the church. It was called a parish worker. She was an artist. She was also always also a parish worker for our little country church. And as I said, there was a lot of poverty around, and my mom knew every family. And so I grew up, just jumping with her in the minivan and going all over the country, meeting, some of the poorest families who are our neighbors. And it was, like now she's a very prominent artist. And, I'm always like, go back to being that mom, not the mom who knows all these famous people. It was a wonderful way to grow up. It really was. And so I went to college in Chicago, and it was a huge shock. I couldn't figure out how all those people lived up in the air in boxes. I mean, I literally remember having this thought, how is this possible? But in my sophomore year, I took a class called Intro to Sociology. And the professor said, I have an extra credit opportunity in Cabrini Green. Now, I had no idea what Cabrini Green was. It was the most notorious housing project in the United States at the time. I was completely ignorant of this, but I knew what extra credit was. So I raised my hand and ended up spending, kind of majoring in Cabrini Green and minoring in college. I mean, I really got involved there first with the indigent elderly, and then with families who were part of a tutoring program. So when I went to graduate school, and I needed to do a project, I knew right where to go. I knew right where, who to talk to and how to get in. Usually it would take you years to establish rapport in a place like Cabrini. But I'd been there for years, just doing simple things like making breakfasts in a church basement and helping kids with their math homework. So it was a real opening for me. And then I got this job. Back then it was hard to make your way financially in grad school. So I got this job teaching college courses to welfare recipients on the west side of Chicago. And so after I teach this class, the students, we kind of have a focus group in the church parlor. It was also the university was renting out a site in the neighborhood in a church. And so my students were, they were great. I had been taking this course on poverty at Northwestern with this famous man, Christopher Jenks. And we were reading all the tomes and looking at all the statistics. And he would say, well, what are you learning in North Lawndale anyway? And I would say, well, nobody can live on welfare. You have to cheat to survive. And I just thought doesn't everyone know this? Everyone in my class knows this. But it turned out that no one in the world of academia or policy knew this. So my first book was really traveling the country for 6 years, collecting stories from over 400 women on how they survived welfare and low-wage employment. So that was kind of the starting point. And then, of course, what people wanted to know after I wrote that book is, radio and TV talk shows teach you a lot. What they wanted to know is why did they have the kids in the first place? And why don't they just get married? And so that began a whole new line of work, which I know you're familiar with, really on poverty and the family. So it's kind of one lucky conversation after another.
So it sounds like when you went to college initially, you were not necessarily thinking that you would go into this line of work.
No, it was. I have to really credit one of my sociology professors, David Claiborne. It was a small college, small enough that one of our classes could fit in the back of his pickup. And he drove us all over Chicago. And he was the first one actually who took me to Cabrini Green and offered this internship. And I think what really hooked me was the people in Cabrini were from Mississippi, and I was from rural Minnesota, and I couldn't get my hands around the city. You know how urban people, they just get right to the point. Well, rural people don't do that. So when I got to Cabrini and got to know all these fascinating people, they were like me. They were rural people. They had rural sensibilities. They thought about, for years when I'd call home, I'd say, "Dad, how are the crops?" My father wasn't even a farmer. He was an educator, but the agricultural way of thinking about life and the rhythms of the seasons and so on were something I really shared with these Mississippians. So I kind of felt at home. So very random, but I would say that's probably what hooked me. And then of course the childhood with my mother, just having this experience, meeting people whose lives were just really different from my own and having that be part of my everyday experience.
When you described yourself and you talked about coming from a town, where there was some amount of poverty, are you thinking primarily in terms of economic hardship or, cultural poverty or would you classify things by different categories like that?
Probably not, because of how it can be misconstrued. But I would say, so in Minnesota, the poverty is white and Native American, and I don't pretend to understand Native American poverty. But many times, kids growing up in poor families in Minnesota, white kids, they would experience one generation of poverty. It was sort of a one and done. And this pattern is, and especially when you think of even when you think of urban white poverty, it's often a one generation and done. What was really different is that when I was in North Lawndale, for example, many of the young people that I was interviewing were second and third generation poor. In fact, longer, going back to the history of sharecropping in Mississippi. And it wasn't necessarily due to lifestyle choices. It was due to the fact that when they came from the South, where there was such extreme cultural restrictions, to the North, the labor market began to lock them out in all kinds of ways. As soon as Blacks moved to North Lawndale, which was the second place of settlement after the Black Belt. So almost all African Americans who came to Chicago after 1940 came through this neighborhood. And of course, the economy is slow to incorporate these new workers. There's a ton of prejudice, so they really can't move out of these Black neighborhoods. And then as soon as the riots occur following the assassination of Martin Luther King, all the industry leaves. So we have Sears, International Harvester, Zenith, the biggest employers in Chicago, just flee this neighborhood, leaving it really jobless. And your work disappears in this neighborhood. So I continue to study North Lawndale. I was just there last summer. I'm planning to go again in August, and I'm now interviewing those early hopeful migrants, the elders who came with the Great Migration, to learn about their lives. But it's striking how the exclusions in the North mimicked the exclusions in the South, except we replaced sharecropping with these but what the famous sociologist William Julius Wilson called these jobless ghettos, and those continue today. So I think most of what we're talking about is structural. There are always cultural aspects. Oftentimes, I studied a group of families who left Baltimore high-rise housing for more advantaged neighborhoods. It's just part of the federal Moving to Opportunity experiment run by HUD. And I followed those families with kids for 12 years. And it was striking because when they were living in high-rise public housing, they would tell me that they were unmotivated, they were unhopeful. They weren't parenting in the way that they thought they should. They move out of these environments and their parenting changes, their outlook on life changes. So I think it's very hard to know, what's kind of structural and what's cultural, because so many of our of the ways that we go about moving through the world and the kinds of things we think about ourselves and others are so shaped by our context. So I guess I've become less and less convinced that much of this isn't structural.
You started out with that, I think it was one credit working in Cabrini Green, and you've been doing this for quite a while. So are there things that you have seen that have changed for better or worse in poverty, family life, and maybe anything else you would wrap in with this?
First of all, let's talk about the family. So Promises I Could Keep, literally, I was on these radio and TV talk shows, and people would ask me, Dr. Edin, I get that no one can live on welfare. That's you told that story well, but why didn't they just get married, and why did they have the kids in the first place? And these are the questions the middle class asks about the poor. And I didn't have any idea what the answers to those questions were. But I'd spent 6 years traveling the country talking to single moms, and I thought they would probably have something to say about it. So I moved my family, and I moved into America's poorest small city, Camden, New Jersey, which was really an epicenter of single parenthood, and then the greater Philadelphia area, and spent another half decade talking with hundreds of low-income single mothers, and then eventually absent fathers about this question. And the stories that surprisingly low-income single mothers value marriage. In fact, they value it so much they consider it sacred, and they don't want to sully it with their own imperfect relationship. So they're waiting to meet both a financial and a kind of an emotional bar. But meantime, there were not a lot of opportunities. Young people are all about meaning and identity. So there weren't a lot of opportunities for meaning and identity. And there was such a strong value on children not as a sort of thing I could brag about, but as a place where I can invest and create meaning and value in the world. It's a place where I can contribute. And there was no better place. I was 30 before I had kids. And my respondents would often point this out, that I was really weird, or even that I was selfish. They really saw having kids as a selfless act and something that was just a natural part of life. So it was really this kind of a story that really turned the conventional wisdom on its head. Low-income women do greatly value marriage, but they don't think a poor but happy marriage can survive. And largely the data have borne that out. Now, what has changed about that story? So during that time, I direct a large birth cohort study. So I'm speaking now from survey data. During that time, among women without a college degree, a fairly large portion had their child, before the age of 22, while they were still young or teenagers. In our survey, which is a birth cohort of women having children in 2000, about 40%, and our survey is more disadvantaged than the U.S. population, so keep that in mind. About 40% of them had a child by age 22. Only 15% of their daughters. We're continuing to follow them for 27 years. Only 15% of their daughters have. So this is a huge change. And if you think back to the popular discourse, right, single parenthood was the boogeyman. If only people wouldn't have children in their teens, everything would be so much better. So what's really changed is that very, very few women under the age of 22 are having kids. And many of those that are immigrant women, and they're married. So the vast majority of young people are saying, I can't have a kid. I got to go to school. I got to get a job. I got to both work and I got to go to school. The real question is whether that's paying off for them.
You said the birth year was 2000.
Right.
It is 2026. And so by whatever year, let's say, because I think it was by 22.
Yeah, we looked at births that would be, 21 and younger. So less than 22 in among both the mothers and then their daughters. So you see this really huge change in early fertility. You do see more high school completion, at least starting college, but it is not clear whether women's lives are actually better as a result of these sacrifices.
And in order to be still included in this group by, let's say, age 20 or so, are you assessing the children? Are you categorizing them or based on their parents' state of income, I guess, at that time? As in the child is, do you categorize someone as living in poverty depending on where they're at as an individual at the age of 20 versus where their parents were at the beginning or where their parents are at that time? At
the same age.
Okay.
So we do know that the second thing I think that's really changed about poverty, and I think this is really easy to miss and it's profound, and this relates to my book with Luke Schaefer, $2 a Day, Living on Virtually Nothing in America, which charts the rise in extreme poverty in the United States. If you look at poverty statistics, you'll see that we used to have a child poverty rate very consistently of about 20%. We had a big decrease in the 60s due to the war on poverty and social programs, and then we really just stayed at 20%. We're now really seeing a decline in child poverty. That's pretty consistent. We see some ups and downs with the Great Recession, with the post-COVID period, and so on. But you're seeing some declines in child poverty, but what that masks is instability. So what we found in $2 a Day is that you are much more likely today in the era of welfare reform, when you can no longer really get cash assistance in most places. Mothers are much more likely to work. Single mothers are much more likely to work, but their work is increasingly unstable. And so what you see is not, the regular poor and then the $2 a day poor, but rather more and more of the regular poor and the near poor falling into these spells of extreme destitution. And, what's unclear is whether that's kind of a poverty trap, whether that's sets, has a domino effect that then has downstream consequences where people can't really lift themselves up from poverty. And we followed ethnographically about a dozen families over years and, still in touch with many of them, although we're not researching them now. They're just writing to us. And it is very hard. Once families have fallen into that virtually cashless existence, it's very hard then to come back up. So we're seeing this, and then you end up getting evicted. There are all kinds of things that are really costly to families, even if their overall average annual income has marginally improved. what we really see is this increasing instability. And that's really baked into the labor market and the ways the labor market has changed as it's fissured. Subcontracting and franchising, that there are these structural changes in the economy that really have made work for people without a college degree incredibly and increasingly precarious. So those are kind of the two biggest changes I would say that I've seen in poverty over the last 30 years. I published my first book in 1997. So next year it will be 30 years since I first published a book. And so it's been interesting thinking back on what's changed over the last 30 years.
You reminded me of something that I highlighted in Making Ends Meet, and it's in the foreword, so there's more that we can get into, but I'll just read it. So, if a firm can train someone to do a job in a few days, it has no incentive to keep her on the payroll when business is slow, when she misses work because her children are sick, or when she irritates her supervisor. I mean, that was a little unsmooth in the reading, but
it's never been more true.
Coming back to this cohort, it sounds like the children in this study they've remained in poverty or near poverty. And so I couldn't assume, for example, or maybe I shouldn't assume, but we could test it perhaps, or you would know, that these children, these daughters, not having children before the age of 22, that I should not assume that that's associated with an improving socioeconomic status. If they had moved into the middle tier of income, then you might say, oh, well, that's a middle class value. You didn't say exactly that. I don't want to put words into your mouth, but it sounds like there's something else contributing to this, and maybe that's the instability on top of already dealing with challenges of poverty.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're now viewing them at age 27, and we'll be able to compare them to their parents at age 27 as well. So the jury is kind of out on how they do long term. We do go into the field and talk to families one-on-one, a small subsample of the families, which we did when the kids were 19, and really just saw a lot of dislocation among both the daughters and the son, struggling through getting that high school degree and then starting and stopping in college, you're kind of trying to follow the script, right? What some conservatives have called the success sequence. You're putting off childbearing. You're trying to get a leg up in the labor market. You're trying to get an education, but it's in fits and starts. There are very few easy entry points. In this other study I told you about, where we followed these families for 12 years who had been living in public housing but had gotten this voucher. So we followed 150 of these kids and their parents for this very long period of time. And only one of those young people had attained a 4-year degree. They may have been working, they may have been going to school, but it was an incredible struggle for them to achieve upward mobility. So it'll be interesting to see, this great boogeyman of the 90s, babies having babies. I think one of the more sensational books was titled, "This was the social problem that could explain the persistence of poverty." It'll be very interesting to see how that turns out. And since fertility has been falling now for really since 2013 in the U.S., there's what's kind of a sharp fall. We were at right about replacement, and then our fertility began declining. It'll really be interesting to see if does this lead to a wave of prosperity among the poor? Probably not. And in part because when moms had that source of meaning and identity in their kids, they were really motivated. They went to work. They went to school. They had something to live for. They had a sense of purpose, and it's not clear where that sense of purpose is going to come from if the labor market doesn't come through for them, and if higher education proves so difficult to follow through on, that or they get a worthless degree, which is happening among many of our kids. Many of our kids, the majority of the kids in that 12-year study who did go on to post-secondary education went to for-profit trade schools. And many of those degrees were worthless.
When you mentioned just a minute ago that effectively it remains to be seen what these, daughters who may have children much later, maybe they won't have children, it remains to see what the long-term impacts might be. I was starting to think about the 90s reform of welfare. And so, it's not like you haven't written about fatherhood and all of that, right? So I want to call that out. I mean, I have, doing the best I can right here. And so it's not like you've looked at only one side of this, so to speak, the motherhood side or the fatherhood side. But what I was starting to wonder about is, there's all of this talk about more and more men, whether they father children or not, are spending more time alone, gaming, whatever it is that they're doing. And so then I was thinking, well, if someone has to deal with the instability that you're talking about, if they can't get by on welfare alone, and I think it's in Making Ends Meet where you talk about that, then, I could understand finding meaning, finding a sense of purpose in my children, because I think there's some of that is built into us as human beings, right? That there's this thing that you want to get up every morning for. That feels intuitive to me, that it would be on average more natural for women to find it there, whereas the men can father a child and kind of go off alone. But if they're not mothering children, if they're not having children, then I'm starting to think, well, gosh, where might we be in 10 years or 20 years? If you had to project into the future, where certain cohorts end up, or what the next outcome of this change is, do you have a prediction?
So let's go back to welfare reform. So we used to have this program called AFDC, where if you could prove you were in need, the government had to give you the money, and the money was very little in some states like Mississippi or Texas, and it was relatively generous in places like New Hampshire and Vermont, but it still wasn't enough, even in the most generous state, to actually pay all your bills. And that's been true of programs for single mothers back to really the mid 1930s. They've always been insufficient to families' needs. So, of course, families have had to scramble and violate the rules and break the laws just to keep their kids from being taken away by child welfare. So the system prior to welfare reform was a terrible system. But it did provide a floor. Now, critics of welfare said, well, what it's doing is breaking up the family, and it's incentivizing early and unwed childbearing. So people did have, some folks did have very good intentions with welfare reform. The idea was to put the family back together. Now, that turned out to sort of be a false premise that welfare was breaking up the family. The best economists working on this, Robert Moffat, has found the effect was very small, only before 1975, and only for white women. So that turned out to be a false premise. But the idea that you would kind of shore up the family, get moms into the labor market, more moms into the labor market, was a good thing. Of course, what we document in Making Ends Meet is they already were in the labor market because they couldn't afford welfare. This pushed them kind of out of the brown economy and into the mainstream economy. The really good thing I think about welfare reform is we built a system to subsidize low-wage employment called the Earned Income Tax Credit, so that if you work full-time for a year at a low-wage job, you wouldn't be poor. And that program has pushed millions of low-income single mothers into the labor force. Their labor force participation now is extraordinarily high, except for women with infants. The vast majority are in the labor market. There's very little non-work, but you've lost this floor because after welfare reform, many states decided to spend the money on other things, like their child welfare system or pre-K. My state spends its money on pre-K. So they took that money and they spent it on other things. But you did not have a floor. There was not a program you could turn to and be guaranteed some sort of check. So, and that's where of course, the instability comes from. The labor market begins becoming more and more exploitative, but there's no floor. And so then you get this $2 a day poverty. So I think, welfare reform has both good and bad effects. But what we didn't see was an increase in marriage. And of course, in talking to both the mothers and the fathers, it's not that marriage has gone away. It's not that it's disappeared from the lexicon, although maybe for some families it kind of has. Many people think this is the right way to live and the best way to raise your kids. But because people hold marriage to such a high standard, when their own relationships can't live up to this standard, they don't end up marrying. Now, many do marry eventually, but these are more like marriages that occur after your prime family building years, and often not with the partner of your that you had children with. So. The kind of the rise of the involved stepfather is another probably new trend in poverty and family life. Is many mothers do just stay single, but of those who don't, many of them do find stable partnerships. And what we've found is that in many cases, those men are very involved with her children and contribute positively. So, what's happening with the men is scary. We see this withdrawal from the labor market. About half of that is men in and out of the labor market, and half of that is men who seem to be permanently disconnected, at least from the formal labor market. There's no welfare for men. There was a small program prior to welfare reform that has been wiped out in almost every state. So if men don't work, they don't eat. And it's not clear what's really going on. Even in our survey where we had mothers and fathers from the birth, we were following mothers and fathers from the birth. It's really hard to contact these men now 27 years after that baby was born. We do know that men want to stay involved with their children. We know that they value fatherhood. We know that even if they've had failed past relationships, they've lost contact with their kids, they try to reconnect with a new family. It's almost like a family go-round where you move from one family to another to try to enact fatherhood in the way that you desire. And some of those men end up doing pretty well with younger kids, but often they've in fact, the modal man is involved with the younger kid, but is uninvolved with an older child. So they're neither angels nor demons. They're struggling to enact this father role, but very imperfectly. And again, I think we really have to look to declining labor market activities, opportunities for men without college degrees. They've been declining since 1977. That's a long, long time. We don't really have the sort of the family jobs that we had in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s for these men. Oftentimes, they've got a lot of behavioral problems. They spend more time out on the street than women, so they're often traumatized. Many struggle with addiction, and there's violence in the home. So all of these things are really serious problems that impinge upon the ability of mothers to secure stable partners for their kids and for fathers to enact the father role in a way that's conducive to kids' well-being.
In your research, or these, I guess, the younger generation of women that are having children at lower rates, Do you imagine that they might end up in a similar place to these men, the increasing number of men that are not in the labor force? Or do you imagine they might be ending up somewhere else, psychologically, financially, in some other way?
That's a great question. And it definitely is not something I've thought of before. So, our safety net is really organized around people with dependent children living in their households.
Yeah.
In fact, we have a word for adults that do not have dependent children living with them. ABODs, able-bodied adults without dependent children. And these ABODs have seen program cut after program cut after program cut. Even food stamps, you can only get for a couple of months in a 4-year period. There's just nothing for them. We know that the EITC, on the other hand, which is only really available in its full form to people with dependent children, incentivizes work and participation in the economy. It's my guess would be that many of these women will have children. We might see them having children in their late 20s. Their college-educated counterparts are. If you go into a neighborhood in DC, of young people working on the Hill, nobody's got kids. You go into a neighborhood where you have more career staffers who are in their 30s, there are baby strollers everywhere. So you may see this kind of mid to late 20s among the least advantaged, and then the 30s. We certainly don't have any evidence of a decline in the desire for children. So, but I think this delay is probably going to turn out to be historic, especially at the bottom of the income distribution. It's really within one generation, we might be seeing average age at first childbirth change that's really astonishing. So you would, and young people are not going to have the support of the safety net during those years because they won't be eligible for tax credits. They won't be eligible in many cases for other safety net programs. We're going to see fewer of them supported by government-funded health insurance. A SNAP is going to be increasingly limited for this population. And, it's unclear how states are going to handle these work requirements. How are we going to monitor in real time whether or not somebody's working and adjust their benefits in a timely way? So all of this is a brave new world, but it is really, really interesting that young people will come of age entering an increasingly unstable labor market without a lot of government supports, in part because they waited to have children.
Do you think that a potential contributing factor of substance, of some significance, might be that there's less community cohesion or community connection potentially amongst younger generations? You may not have your 15-year-olds perhaps that in the 90s, you were 80s, whatever, you wanted to connect with people, you pretty much had to go out and physically be with them. But now I may lay on the couch and be on Instagram or whatever. And that lack of connection just creates, frankly, in a very simplistic representation here, less opportunities to create children.
That's interesting. I mean, we do see less dating, less engagement with sexual activity. It does seem to be a cautious generation of young people. But what I can tell you from data is this. So how do we meet people in the old days? We used to go to the movie theater or the bowling alley or the roller rink or the soda shop or whatever. I mean, I grew up kind of with all these accoutrements. And one thing we saw from our work in Central Appalachia, where we show up there, to do research on extreme poverty. And what we find is, of course, they're in the throes of an opioid epidemic. And the county that we end up choosing is the epicenter of this this crisis, and everyone says, well, the reason so many young people are turning to drugs is because there's nothing to do for the young people. Nothing to do here but drugs. So this comes up over and over again. I'm like, this can't possibly be true. And then, as we started hearing this more and more, I thought, well, we should really check this out. So we went to the U.S. Census of Businesses. It's a wonderful little census where we could actually look. So what I'm giving you an institutional answer. Look at the number of places in a community that offer things to do. And we were able to look at the extent to which those things to do are atrophying over time. And to the extent that places were losing these things to do, what you saw was an increase in opioid deaths. So we actually had some evidence that this crazy claim was true. And we told, some people who really know a lot about this, Angus Deaton and Ann Case, and Angus, of course, won the Nobel Prize. And they wrote the important book, Deaths of Despair. He said, yes, it makes total sense to me. So what's happening across America, maybe especially rural America, but also urban America, is the loss of these institutions that create the opportunity to build social bonds. And, I used to be the downstairs neighbor of Bob Putnam, of course, who wrote the famous book, Bowling Alone. When I was at Harvard, and I said, Bob, it's not just that people are bowling alone. The bowling alley is gone. So we do see this incredible atrophying of places to connect. And this is really affecting young people. And then, of course, the digital age. I was just on Governor Sherrill's. I just co-led her task force on child mental health and online safety. So I'm very into this space that you're in your head, but this just exacerbates the problem. Mm-hmm. I definitely have evidence that as places for young people to gather and build social bonds have begun disappearing across the United States, we do see this. Also, if you look at data coming out of the Opportunity Insights team at Harvard, they measure cross-class friendships. And they find that in the very same areas where we document this loss of these institutional, we call them social infrastructure, following Eric Kleinenberg, who coined the term, but we see this atrophying of social infrastructure. It's not the bridge, it's the bowling alley or the social infrastructure. Those are also the places that are least likely to have cross-class friendships. And cross-class friendships are the strongest single predictor of whether you have a lot of intergenerational mobility in a place. Like you were referring earlier to this work that shows that if a child in one community moves to another community versus a child that stays in place, they end up having different outcomes, at least in the aggregate. Place has a tremendous influence on us. And one of the reasons is because in these places where social infrastructure is sort of collapsed, we see just this lack of social bonding, including potentially bonding across social classes, it's really how kids seem to be getting a leg up in these communities with really, really high mobility rates, is that, middle-class people and poor people are connecting. And those connections are helping those poor kids reach the middle class.
So let's go back a couple of decades. And I forget how you put it, but you said that something like there are not as many family jobs, I think, something along those lines. And so when the man has a decent job, and has the potential to care for a family, then before he's married, before he's had children, it seems to me like that potentially puts him in a position where he's a more desirable mate than if he didn't have that job. And I believe on average, right, that women's labor force participation and average income and so on has been rising. And there's a lot of research that I don't know here, but I believe on average that, you know, women, when they look for a mate, right, are looking across the class spectrum and up, not too often down. And whereas that's not always the same for men. And so I'm wondering if, as the average, you know, income status of women has risen, that's also then contributing to the fact that, and men has either stayed the same or lowered. I don't know what the research is at the moment, that there are just fewer men uh, i- up in the class hierarchy, income hierarchy above women.
This is exactly right. So when you look at marriage, increasingly there's a simple college divide, right? The college educated are marrying, the non college educated are not marrying. And it's really pernicious in part because the higher in the educational spectrum you go, the more people are likes are marrying likes. So college educated women are marrying college educated men, and they're very seldom. They do marry down some, in part because you have to now. There are more college educated women. More women are going to college than men, and this is part of the problem. Some women are marrying down, but they're marrying the best educated or the best able, highest earning of the non college men. So what the non college women have left is a very, it's not a very rosy picture. So the necessity that because there are more women than men now going to college, the necessity that women marry down means that the pool for non-college educated women is really not looking good. Yeah. So not college educated men are marrying college educated women. But women are marrying down. Women are marrying down, I think about a third of the time now. And they're really getting, that maybe it's somebody with an associate's degree who's got an HVAC company, or maybe it's like my friend in Baltimore whose husband started his own business right out of high school. So those men are marrying college educated women, and you're kind of taking all of the most marriageable men out of the pool for the non college educated women, leaving them really without potential partners or without obvious potential partners. So this is one of the most fascinating changes. Women always got their status by marrying up, but now too many of them went to college. So you've really changed the demography of the problem.
Coming into this conversation, one thing that I wanted to ask you about was the concept of marriage. If that's changed within certain groups or maybe more broadly, potentially. But then as you're talking about that, I'm also thinking about, does the meaning of marriage, if I can separate that from just the idea of marriage, the ideal of marriage, has that changed over time? Because if I'm a 15-year-old woman and if we go back to, I don't know, the 1950s or sometime in the past, and I'm thinking, well, people like me get married by the time they're, I don't know how old, 18, 20 years old. I'm going to think about marriage very differently from being a 15-year-old woman in the year 2000. And then, we pick out any individuals here, men or whatever. And so I wanted to ask you about the concept of marriage potentially changing over time as you see it, but also as we're talking about a change, I don't know if it'll be long-term or not, of marrying down to some extent, if that influences the concept of marriage as well.
So the meaning of marriage is seen a radical change. And the great sociologist Andrew Cherlin has written about this, I think, better than anyone. But he's a survey guy, but you can see it in interviews in the community over the years. So it was really more of a practical institution. Two people side by side accomplishing the production of a household where you could raise kids. And then it became much more about the adults, much more about adult fulfillment. Anthony Giddens talks about it as a pure relationship. Andrew Cherlin talks about it as a companionate marriage. And I just had a student who did interviews with college seniors in Japan and the United States, asking them about the meaning of marriage. And they're like, well, I need a guy with a high EQ. I'm like, what's going on here? They want men who are like soft and fuzzy and who know how to communicate. I want a guy who can really hold his own in a conversation at a cocktail party. It's really fascinating, but the standards for marriage have just really gone up. And so the middle class are finding these pure relationships, and they're divorcing a lot less. They're finding them in their late 20s, early 30s, and their divorce rates are way down, especially from the 1980s. But among the poor, these same set of expectations have trickled down, and they too are looking for soulmates. And it's just, given what's happening with the marital pool, it's much harder to find them. It's astonishing to me that we see this persistence of this cultural marriage has almost become more significant, more sacred, maybe in part because everyone doesn't have to do it anymore. I think we argue in Promises I Could Keep that the lack of a cultural imperative to marry has allowed it to become more special because people can say, no, I'm not going to settle for that. And so you don't really see people settling. These women who are marrying down, that's a great source of a dissertation, because you can imagine that the egalitarian norms that you learn in a college classroom, hopefully, may not be matched by a working class guy. So I would predict, even though it's very unwise to predict, that there would be more friction among those couples and higher rates of divorce potentially because there's friction in gender roles. I guess Claudia Golden, the economist who just won the Nobel Prize, says, that there's sort of this flexible egalitarianism in the United States. Among the elite, we've kind of learned how to share roles, and men are doing more housework and doing more of the child rearing and all of this stuff. But when you start seeing this kind of reverse marrying down, it'll be fascinating to see whether there's enough glue to hold those couples together, given these maybe different visions of how the family should work. So you have egalitarian women, more traditional husbands. And maybe that worked, that when men were the ones marrying down, they got the traditional wives and they could stay at work as long as they wanted. So another burden might be that her career, and she ends up out earning him. What we know from the data is generally she doesn't out earn him, but she's closer. She's closer to being a parity, and that would be interesting also to see what that led to in terms of the battles between the sexes in the home.
When you described yourself, you referenced you talked about having a lot of conversations with people, that were poor, dealing with challenges of poverty. And it seems to me, in reading a lot of your work, sitting down across the table from someone must give you a much richer sense where there are gaps in the data that, someone who's doing primarily desk research would, the understanding that they would have.
This has been my shtick. So, back in the day, this is still sort of true. You have your quantitative people over here, and you have your qualitative people over here, and they don't talk to each other. But my mentor was a numbers guy, Christopher Jenks, one of the best numbers guys in the business. And my other mentor was Howie Becker, who is probably the best go talk to him person in the business. And so I, from the very beginning, and I'm not good at math, but I love statistics. I had this dual training. I don't know. It's like this is the magic, is when you're in conversations with the go out and talk to people or in conversation with the numbers people. And, I've co-published with economists and quantitative sociologists and behavioral scientists that have really never done an in-depth interview. And those, I just have a paper from a collaboration like that on violence in the West Side of Chicago coming out, I think today, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences Journal. So that's where the richness is. And all of the mysteries that I've explored start in the quantitative world. And so I'm an avid consumer of that sort of information. Like, I eat it for breakfast. Luke Schaefer, one of my very frequent co-authors, he's is a complete numbers guy, although I drag him into the field and make him meet the families, and he loves it, but it's the conversation of the two methods. And I also think, like, if you want to have any kind of policy influence and you're a qualitative person, you need to engage with that world of numbers. And if you're a quantitative person and you want legislators to actually listen to you, if you want your books in the bookshelves of the nation's lawmakers, you've got to know something on the ground about how people actually live. You've got to have the stories. Humans are convinced through narrative. So the narratives and the numbers are kind of the magic. And I wish more qualitative researchers would be sort of less hostile to quantitative researchers. There's a lot of openness among quantitative researchers for the kind of information we could produce. If anything, I think, maybe it used to be that qualitative people were sort of dismissed. But now I think there's a lot of interest. And I know leading economists are now collaborating with qualitative sociologists to try to figure out what the data that they're collecting mean. And that is a really positive development. We just need a lot more of it.
It seems to me like one advantage that you get if you are sitting down talking to an individual or family and you have 100 people in your study or 300 families or whatever the number is, that you get a lot of opportunities at bat and you learn from those repeated attempts, just like, we referenced people, increasing social isolation and spending more time online and all that. You get less opportunities to make friends, to recover from making a bad joke, whatever it is. Well, then that's not to say that it's not a value judgment, right? Like, you're not a bad person necessarily, but it's just harder to get good at that thing.
I do have a story about that. So oftentimes the real learning comes from the unguarded moments where the extra stuff, my Minnesota naivete can kind of benefit me sometimes, but I was just, there was a mother in promises I could keep. And we got to be friends, and I was just hanging out with her. And we went to the Pizza Hut, and her son Shalik was with us, and she had broken up with Shalik's father. He had actually left her and got another woman pregnant right around the time Shalik was born. So it was super painful. And so at this lunch at the pizza place, she sheepishly admits to me that she's pregnant. And Henry's the father. And then she just looks at me and she says, so this is the moment where everything changed for me. She says, someday I'm going to plan my babies like you white women do. You have to have your fancy house and your fancy car and your college degree, and then maybe you decide you'll have children. And I was floored. Like, yeah, you are right. I am selfish. Look at what a great mom you are. Look at what you're sacrificing for you. It just hit me. It just hit me, between the eyes. And so it's the moments like that, like sitting around in that church parlor in North Lawndale when, I'm telling my students that I'm taking this course on poverty with Christopher Jenks. And they say, well, nobody can live in welfare. Everybody's got to cheat to survive. So that one sentence is probably the most important sentence in my entire career. I was able to prove that, but it all came from just this off conversation. So you're just in the mix. You spend so much time. You're kind of going through the process of collecting data, but you're also just hanging out and you're having meals and every once in a while you just get lucky.
Actually, one of the things you were just talking about illustrates something. I gave a keynote on Friday, and one of the things that I was talking about was inspiration. And I said, inspiration can feel random, but for inspiration to really be of value and to be reliable, it has to result from attention. That it's not enough to have the inspirational idea. It's to pay attention to what was just an idea and then say there's something there.
Yep.
And you've had a few of those. And actually, I think I remember that story from Promises I Can Keep. There were some other things that stuck out that I reference when I talk about culture change with organizations. I remember in Promises I Can Keep, it might have been at the end in like an afterword or something. You all say something like, you interviewed, I can't remember, 200, 300 women, whatever it was, over a long time frame. And something like almost none of them said that they had close friends or any friends at all. And that's something that I don't know how much that has shown up in your other work, but to me, that really stuck out and then helped to give color to other information that I have encountered as I then am able to piece things together and use them for my own work and understanding of the world.
Yeah, the social isolation is really profound, and it's a way of keeping safe. So when being good is, we see this all over the data. When being good means being alone, isolating oneself. When being safe means that you have to isolate yourself because other people are seen as sources of trouble and problems rather than sources of support. You see that a lot, I think, in high violence neighborhoods. But in general, if you have to be isolated to be good and stay safe, there's something wrong with the society around you. And I think these kids are right that in the context in which they live, it is the smart thing to be isolated.
Yeah.
In order to stay safe. And of course, this affects young men more than young women because if you get involved in street life, like in our work on violence in North Lawndale, and this is also the work of my colleague Megan Kang, if you get involved in street life, the only safe way to withdraw is to what she calls become hidden, become forgotten. So you stay in the house.
If you could share, one or two things that would help the average person in the middle class or a policymaker understand something about poverty or family life in America that you feel like would really move the needle. Or maybe if it's not for a policymaker that, or for me as a donor to causes or a voter,
Yeah.
maybe it's just to develop empathy. If you had one or two things, do those come to mind immediately? Like, Eric, it would help to understand this.
I think you have to rub shoulders. I tell all my graduate students, at the end of the semester, they're all doers, they're all public policy students, so they're going to go out and solve poverty. I said the first thing you should do is form some cross class friendships with young people. So that's there's overwhelming data that is really meaningful. In your personal life, try to think about where you live. Are you so obsessed with providing the very best school in the entire school district for your kids that you live in an all white neighborhood without any poor folk? My parents didn't choose to do that. And I went to a pretty bad high school actually, but I'm so grateful to them for just, saying that this is real. This is the real America. And we need to expose our kids to this. So my kids have grown up, they've been following me around. They're in their 30s now, following me around in all these places. They have met these respondents. They've had a front row seat, and there's just such a remarkable young women. So, you can think about that, just diversifying your life. Second, if you have limited time, but you really want to give back, there's an organization called Board Effect. I gave a keynote last night for a local organization in Princeton called Housing Initiatives of Princeton. And they're just a group of concerned citizens who have gotten together and formed a nonprofit to help house people from Princeton, people living in the Princeton area, help house them and keep them housed stably. It's a remarkable organization. And I will tell you, people say, oh, how can you do this work? It must be so hard, so depressing. It is the best way to spend your life. It is, first of all, talk about every day I say, there is so much lost potential. These young guys in Chicago that are violence involved, they don't always do beautiful things, but you just see what people are capable of and who they are, beyond the veneer. So I think it's incredibly hopeful. It'll make you more hopeful. It'll probably make you more satisfied too, because suddenly you really don't need a bigger TV.
I feel like it's wrapped into a little bit of this. You said when you were talking about rubbing shoulders, but also coming around to hope. I think it was research from Robert Putnam. I think that he and some of his collaborators had put out some research in the early 2000s that they found that trust was lower in the most diverse communities on average, the trust of your neighbor and all that. And there was a lot of, sort of, back then we didn't have the term clickbait, right? But there was clickbait like headlines, right? Sensational headlines.
So he's very controversial.
Right. But I think, as I recall the work, they did a lot of follow-up to understand why was this. And one of my big takeaways was it's not so much about being around. You can't just live next to someone who's different from you. You have to feel like you're a part of something together.
Yeah.
And, so that came to mind when you talked about rubbing shoulders. But then also when you mentioned hope, I was thinking about, what gives you hope for the future? But also, like, for me, it seems like there has to be opportunities to feel like we're in this together.
Yeah.
I don't know what those are, but it seems to me like you believe that must be a potential. I don't know for us to feel like we collectively are in this together.
Going back to this point about social infrastructure. So we have thousands of nonprofits in this country. And whenever I meet a representative of a nonprofit organization, they say, well, what should we do? And I say, we should all be endorsing dramatically increasing the budgets of public libraries. There should be a special fund for people who want to stand up the corner cafe. These kinds of big brother, big sister. Pat Sharkey has my colleague, Patrick Sharkey, who's a wonderful criminologist, has this finding that he's looking at the recent great crime decline. And he really finds that the best single predictor of this crime decline is the presence of nonprofit organizations in a community. It seems that the social glue that brings us together can be found in these organizations, that maybe like housing initiatives of Princeton, right? That are kind of providing this connective tissue. So that's where I would look for hope. I mean, I would love to see our some of our religious congregations re-energized. I think that's been a huge loss in American life. I mean, there are pluses and minuses to religious communities. I'm part of one of them, and sometimes it's a soap opera, but it's a coming together of people who are really different from one another in a sustained long-term relationship. I would really, we have a kind of a cool organization in Baltimore called We, Our, Us. And it's a collaboration between a local local Protestant clergy and the Nation of Islam. And it's a group of men, because it's the nation, it's very male focused. This group of men walks through a portion of Baltimore where people are in trouble, and people strike up conversations. Everyone who marches has an app on their phone. If you need a job, they'll find you one. If you need a bed in a rehab center, if you're ready, they'll drive you to Philadelphia for an open bed. And so this is one of the organizations that's been, well, we don't really know. It's very hard, sort of to suss out what's causing what. But finally, many, many years after Freddie Gray was killed at the hands of the Baltimore police, we're finally seeing this just dramatic drop off in homicides in the city. And it may well be that organizations like We, Our, Us that are building these cross-class friendships and connections. And then, after these guys come back from wherever they need to go, they began marching alongside of the original We, Our, Us members. So it's these kinds of little things that maybe don't seem like much. I think this is where the social glue is that begins to rebuild the community. So social infrastructure, nonprofits, anything that allows people to come together for good. So another thing I always tell my students, you should really think about running for office. My brother was a local county DA for a while. In order to get elected, you have to literally go to everyone's house. You learn things about, he discovered this group of people in an underground sod house, having dinner by candlelight. He also found a lot of meth labs. But, I think running for office is a great way to get to know America. And when and we need a more diverse group of people running for office. In my prior book, $2 a Day, we really recommended that people get trained up. And there are organizations like Run for Something that really help young people. In many places where there's really a lot of economic distress, the same elite families have run things for like 100 years or sometimes more. And a lot of times there's just been tremendous corruption. And so, especially, this is from the book, The Injustice of Place, especially in areas that really have an entrenched elite and a lot of poor folk. We need exciting, young, fresh candidates with a different set of biographies and some lived experience.
If someone wants to buy your books or read your other work, where would you direct people?
Yeah, so please, you can buy it off of Amazon, but you can also, go to your local bookstore. So suss out my page on Amazon.com, and then contact, my local bookstore is Labyrinth in Princeton. Contact your local bookstore and try to order it there. That's what I would recommend. But you can go on my website through the Princeton website and see these. I love each one of these books because I loved the process of meeting the people behind them. Yeah, go to the Amazon page and then order from your local bookstore if you can manage it.
think I said this before we started recording, but I was really happy that you agreed to speak with me, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. So, Doctor, I really appreciate you being here. Thank you very much.
It was a joy to talk with you, honestly. And you made me think about things I hadn't thought about before.
I appreciate that. Thank you.